Get ready to enter a brave new world with your host, Vasant Dar.
Brave New World is supported by the Center for Data Science, or CDS, at NYU. If your organization is interested in engaging with CDS through student projects, please email cdsindustry@nyu.edu. For more color on the podcast and additional commentary, please subscribe to our newsletter at vasantdar.substack.com. I've always been fascinated by smell. Smell is visceral. You just know when something doesn't smell right. And a whiff can evoke all kinds of memories. Fundamentally, smell encodes a unique kind of information. I think it has huge potential applications in our lives, such as in medical diagnosis, mental health, security, supply chains, and much more. I think understanding smell will also enhance our understanding of our own brains and the role smell plays in animal intelligence more generally. Joining me today is Dmitry Rinberg, head of the Rinberg Lab on Olfaction at the NYU Medical Center. Dmitry, or Dima as we call him, has been studying the neurobiology of smell for over 2 decades at the most fundamental level, looking inside the olfactory equipment of animals to figure out how odorants interact with biology to produce smell perception. So he knows a thing or two about smell. Dima, welcome to Brave New World. I am delighted to have you on the show.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be here. Heard multiple of your podcasts and very honored to talk here.
Thanks. I've been wanting to talk to you for some time now about smell, which is an area that I've been very fascinated by ever since I read this book called Perfume by Patrick Susskind. And I've just been fascinated with smell. So when we met, I was particularly happy because, I didn't know people working in this area, and you've been working in this area for a long time. So tell us a little bit about your own history and how you got into this area of olfaction.
Thank you, Vasant. It's a little bit random work, but a little bit purposeful. I never thought when I grow up and get education that I will be studying the sense of smell, because I get education in pure physics and did my work in low temperature fluid dynamics and knew nothing about biology or function. And only later I got very interested in the brain and decided to switch to the brain. When I switched to the brain, I was wondering a little bit, kind of trying different system, and found absolutely fascinating system of function that has not been well studied by physicists. And I decided to try. And it was a long journey. I more or less almost 20 years in this field, and never regret that I landed up in this field.
So what was the spark? What actually got you into smell specifically?
Probably no one single spark. It was more or less multiple events. First of all, I do appreciate the person with whom I worked and who showed me the biology of olfactory system, Alan Gelprin, who was a researcher at Bell Labs, but prior full professor at Princeton. So when I joined Bell Labs as a postdoctoral fellow, I started working with Alan Gelprin in a very physics-oriented group, but doing biology. And I got fascinated by that. And then from there, I just started working, learning, and applied physics-type thinking to this very amorphous and not well-studied system.
I guess I should, just tell the audience that we've started working together through one of my PhD students, Vivek Agarwal. And Vivek told me a really fascinating thing. He was attending one of your lectures, and he said you distributed some sort of a smelling strip, and then you showed them a picture of a flower, and they smelled flowers. And then with that same strip, you showed them a picture of a pear, and they smelled a pear, right? And that just completely blew my mind because, I realized that vision is expectation-based, which I actually learned some time ago by reading Oliver Sacks, one of his very interesting stories as to how much expectation plays a role in what we see. Right? We see what we expect to see. But this smell thing just fascinated me. I mean, I guess it tells us that smell is also expectation-based to some extent?
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe even more. Partially, I think there's a lot of high brain function involved in processing the smell, partially because maybe it's harder to formalize it, harder to verbalize some stuff. So you rely on some association, some emotion, or bringing some memory of that. So the smell is... it's not exactly a subject of my research, but there's a lot of talking about it. The smell evokes some emotion and memory, which means that they are affected by high brain areas. And it's quite obvious for many people working in this field. If you like blue cheese, you associate this smell with the blue cheese. But if you give in the smell of blue cheese without blue cheese, you may not like it. It actually may smell terrible. So your perception of the smell is really dependent on the context. But the difficulty and the most fascinating part from that, it's like you have the basic perception of the smell, like you can perceive colors, you can perceive faces, which are affected by context, or affected by surrounding environment. This multiple experiment with colors. If you do different surrounding, you perceive the central color differently. But that on top of our basic perception of the color. And we know a lot about color perception, but we know very little about smell perception. I do believe there is some basic perception of the smell, basic property that, lemon is always smell like lemon. But on top of that, we may change it based on our context, based on our surrounding, based on some memory or something like that. But for me, the question that you brought up are very interesting, but it's a secondary one. Mm-hmm. I still want to answer the first question: why lemon smell like lemon?
So let's get into that. So let's get into the depth here. Like what exactly is smell? How do you think of smell?
My favorite example, my favorite comparison is with color. What is a color? Color is a perceptual variable. Color is, red, green, blue is a perception. But it's relatively easy for us because first we have a good language to describe this is color, this is black, this is gray, this is blue, and so on, because we learn this and we can use our vocabulary to describe it. In reality, there is a physical spectrum that can be different and different spectra, but physical spectrum is the physics, is a stimuli, and color is a perceptual variable. And color is relatively simple, color vision relatively simple compared to smell. The smell is the same thing, except we have a poor vocabulary and the much more degrees of freedom. We basically try to describe smell. We can do the same exercise and ask how the smell, compare the smells and, put some descriptors. But we didn't develop a good language. And to develop a good language, for example, perfumers did develop much better language. And one perfumer described the smell to another perfumer, they understand each other better. We have much poor way to describe the smell. Otherwise, there's no big difference. Color perception and the smell perception is the same, except complexity.
So that's interesting, because this is sort of, I guess, what made our paths cross when I first got interested in smell before we had met. And the way I saw it was that with vision, you had objective ground truth, right? That, like you said, we can all agree that this is black, and that's a box, and this is a table, right? We agree on these things, and so if you want to get someone to recognize things, well, they need to recognize colors and shapes and stuff, but the ground truth is objective. Whereas I realized with smell, it is somewhat slippery, right? That we use language to describe something as smells like perfume or smells like fruit or smells woody or musty or whatever, but it just seems like such a poor way to describe something that's so much richer.
I actually may disagree with you. What is objective in this color yellow? You learn that it's color yellow, and you know that it's color yellow, but what is the ground truth here? It's just the same thing, except the number of degrees of freedom in the color is much less, and we kind of develop our perception that there's a very famous, philosophical question: is your red the same red as mine?
Uh-huh.
And my answer to that your red maybe have very different, representation of the brain, but it's similar located relatively to yellow, green, and blue. That's why when you identify red, you know that it's not all other colors, but there is no real, what you call ground truth. I believe the same thing happening with the smells, except, as I said, it's much, much richer field, and we need much more rich vocabulary that we don't have it, and we don't really train to do this.
So is it? So I'm now actually going to push back a little against that, but because I totally see where you're coming from, that my red may be different from your red, but most of the time we sort of agree that something is dark red or light red, and we've reached this through some sort of experience, trial and error. Someone corrects us and says, no, that's not dark red, that's light red. So we sort of agree on these things. Whereas it seems like with smell, there's just so much more variability. And it's like, you said that, I remember walking into when I was 20 years old, I walked into a cheese shop in Basel because my guest was going to make fondue, and I almost passed out, from that smell. I mean, it's different now. I would probably walk into the same cheese shop and maybe even appreciate some of the smells. But at that time, it was just like I could not. If someone had said this is cheese, I'd said no. I would describe it as something less complimentary.
But hold on a second. If I close your eyes and I give you to smell a lemon, you tell me immediately, oh, I smell lemon. There will be no contradiction.
Sure.
That's the yellow. That you see yellow, you say yellow, you say lemon, or I give you the rose. Oh, this is a rose. It's all in our heads. So this is the perceptual descriptors. This is not physical quality. But when you see when you see green, you also don't know what the physical quality is, because it can be one light of green light, or maybe mixture of yellow and blue. That also creates. So you don't know physical quality. But we agree that's exactly the same, green. So do you follow me?
Yeah. No, I totally get it.
So it's all kind of built up through learning, through training, and what we perceive as the ground truth is actually all in our head, because it's a perceptual.
Yes, and this is actually what I want to get to, because to me, I'm looking at ground truth as something that happens in our head, as opposed to something we verbalize. Right? That's the distinction I'm making.
So now you're touching a very interesting point, because if you look into the story of the color vision, people discovered that we have three color vision only through verbal descriptors, and kind of people were trying to substitute smells and trying to find colors and trying to find the match one color to another, and there was a lot of human psychophysics without going to the brain. It's just much harder in our function, and you're actually pointing out a very important subject, that we don't know why different. So for colors, we know because we have three receptors. We know the spectral properties of individual receptors, and we know how different light activate this receptor, and what we'll get at the end, and why the yellow is yellow and green is green. For function, we don't. It's much less studied field, and we don't know how to approach it. Partially because we don't have tools to measure it. Partially we don't have, good instruments to deliver it, to mix it in a proper proportion. But my feeling is, and as a scientist, what I'm doing is I'm trying to find the underlying fundamentals that will allow us to create the same theory like three-color vision about olfaction. It probably not be as simple as it is, but underlying neuronal dynamics that make you say lemon when you smell lemon, we still don't know. That's very important point.
So why are we in this sort of relatively primitive stage when it comes to understanding olfaction relative to, let's say, vision or some of the other senses? Is it because of the data? I mean, I've been to your lab and it's, you've got like all of this really, really sophisticated equipment, right, that you're using. The mouse has to be perched just right. The odorant has to be, fed to it at just the right time in a certain concentration that must be carefully measured, right? And then in your language, something that really amuses me is you talk about the sniff cycle of a mouse when it's inhaling, and for some reason that reminds you of Bill Clinton. But sort of jokes aside, right? There's like a huge amount of effort that goes into collecting data, right? Relative to, let's say, language and vision, like ChatGPT has occurred because there's gobs of data just out there that machines can learn from. Like same thing applies in vision, I guess. There's so much data that it's easy to get. It's just out there. We can take pictures of things. We can get a machine to learn. But with olfaction, it's just a whole different story, isn't it?
Indeed. And basically, we don't know how to characterize the smell because we have about 10 million, approximately 10 million different molecules. Just every single molecule that is about below 200 Daltons molecular weight will be floating in the air, and almost all of them, with a very, very few exceptions, you can smell, and they evoke percept. This is a huge, and all the molecules are different, and they activate different receptors, and we just don't know which molecules active, what the receptor field of the receptors, how they respond to different molecules, and how this information from the receptors would be combined to evoke the percept. And it's just a huge problem. Partially, it's a data collection problem and a combinatorial. The power of combinatorics is, if you have, 10 million different molecules floating in the air, you can mix them in any different proportion. We don't know the principles, how they mix, how they interact with the receptors. It just, I wouldn't say that we don't know anything. The last, couple decades, there was humongous breakthrough in this field, and I'm actually very happy about the state of the field. But we are in the very beginning of this learning curve, how we acquire data, how we collect data, how we formalize the approaches. And because don't forget, with color vision, we've been lucky. We've been lucky that we have only three color vision, three type of receptors. We have three primary colors, and it was easy to find their combination and kind of make a very basic experiment and find this by basic human psychophysics. Now, imagine just for a second that we had not three but 7 different color receptors, and it will be very hard to find and tune them to match to each other and to find and to discover the underlying principles. Also, we've been lucky with color vision that our eyes is kind of linear integrators. When you can easily mix colors. You can put two lights pointed on a white screen, and you have a mixture of two colors. It's very hard to do with order. So technological problems are very, very obvious. So the space and the approach how to do it, we still try to discover.
Yeah, that's interesting, and I watched some of your lectures where you actually make this case that, in a sense, with vision you can do arithmetic. You can add colors and you know what you'll get. Right, the physics is well understood. Whereas it's hard to do any sort of computation with smell. I think the example you used is if you mix baked potato, cabbage, and something else, you end up with the smell of a potato chip.
I give this example that if you mix the 3 monomolecular odors, each of them is very clear smell. One is rotten cabbage, potato, and toast. When you mix them together, they create a new object like potato chip, and humans definitely identify this as separate object.
Yeah.
We don't know how it's happening. We don't know where it's happening on the receptor level, in the brain. We even don't know what will happen if you never smell potato chip. Is it a memory construct or it's a new construct? We don't know it yet. So, and it's very hard to test because I cannot push, did you ever smell potato chip? Maybe. So that's the problem on the field. I would bring one more problem, just as you asked me the question why there's so much discrepancy, because for a long time we just care much less about the smell and about, we much more visual and auditory creatures, and we do rely a lot on vision, and nobody, people did not pay much attention to smell. But I prepare a special quote for this discussion from Alexander Graham Bell. I guess you know who it is. It's
I do, and there's a curious word he has in that quote. I don't want to steal your thunder, but he actually talks about asafoetida.
Yes,
but go ahead, because I love that quote.
If you don't mind, I'll read this quote.
Yeah.
Did you ever try to measure a smell? Can you tell whether one smell is just twice as strong as another? Can you measure the difference between one kind of smell and another? It is very obvious that we have very many different kinds of smell, and all the way from odor of violets and roses up to asafoetida. But until you can measure their likeliness and differences, you can have no science of odor. If you're ambitious to find a new science, measure a smell. So it was 1914. We moved a little bit from then.
Yeah, that is amazing. More than a century ago. And what amused me is that he talks about asafoetida, which figures very prominently in Kashmiri food. And so it's a spice I actually use a lot. I was like, what? And by the way, this reminds me of another story. I used to pass by this restaurant called NoHo Star every day at some point. And on a certain day of the week, I smelled something that was similar to my own cooking. And I knew I was smelling fennel, which is a very unusual ingredient in most cuisines. People don't use fennel. It's a very niche kind of a thing. And so I walked into that restaurant one day and I said, on a certain, by that time I'd figured it was Tuesday. So I walked in and I said, on Tuesday evenings, your chef cooks something and it's with fennel. Can you tell me what it is? And their first response was, no, it is, no, here's the menu. And I said, no, I'm sure of it. They went inside and sure enough, they came back. So the chef says on Tuesday nights, he makes shrimp and pasta with fennel, So it's one of those things that is just lodged in my memory. I would recognize fennel anywhere, which gets me to two questions, and I, take them in any order you want, because the one thing I figured is let's get into sort of what the equipment looks like. What does the hardware actually look like in simple terms? But my other question, and this pertains to, you talked about there being some breakthroughs. What have been sort of the key moments in the science of olfaction, the key sort of breakthroughs where we've said, aha, now we understand something that we didn't earlier. That's really important in pushing the theory forward. So take either of those, whichever.
So speaking about equipment, the equipment is relatively primitive. We're basically having multiple vials and connected with the tubing and pushing the flow of odors to your nose and asking you how does it smell. You or I train mice, or people train the classical. In 1950s, people like to do experiments with rabbits. People study a lot of dog olfaction. They just need to scale it up. But the equipment is relatively primitive. We don't have color TV. We don't have the fancy loudspeakers that can produce any probable sound. And that's a problem because you cannot bring together 10 million vials and mix them together. It's just impossible, practically impossible. And that brings us to the question of which odor you present, how you work with odors, how you mix them. And kind of good engineering helps. And actually part of, I believe, make me move forward and distinguish myself from other labs is the ability to deliver smell very precisely. Many people, many researchers just put the Q-tip in the vial and bring it to either to animal or to the humans, and it's much less quantifiable. I do believe in quantitative approach to this stimuli delivery, and we have multiple discoveries based on that. Technology is, I would say, in spite of all this stuff, relatively primitive.
So let's dig in a little bit deeper into what you just talked about, which is the importance of precise measurement in this space, right? Because my takeaway, sort of very crude at this point, from some of your experiments is that I guess we should introduce a little bit of language here, just some vocabulary, and I'll state it in simple terms and you can correct me. Right? So the way I understand this is a molecule, an odorant, hits a cell in the nose, which I guess you call an epithelial cell, and we have many of these in the nose, and these are connected to a bulb. An olfactory bulb. Now, one of the other things I want to also bring up is the fact that COVID brought sort of new attention to smell, because a lot of people during COVID lost their sense of smell. And so one of the sort of curious things is like, why did that happen? Like, what was it about the virus that enabled it to disable smell? But to go back to sort of the physics of it, so you have this thing connected to a bulb, and then the bulb communicates to the brain, right, through these, what you call mitral and tufted cells, right? So this is sort of the progression of information from the moment something hits your nose to it's being received in the brain. So just walk us through the series of chemical and electrical things that happen, because this is fascinating and it's complex.
Absolutely, and that's actually it's a lot of beauty in the system and organizational system, and we actually know a lot about that. What we try to understand the meaning of this architecture. So basically, in order to sense an odor, you need to inhale it, because the receptors are located deep in the nose, and the odor molecules need to travel to your nose deep and just to be absorbed by the mucus and the epithelium. And the cell is sitting there, and the receptors are located on their kind of branches of these cells, called cilias. And each receptor has its own individual property that sends some different features of the molecules. And there was some ideas of kind of lock and key combinatorial theory that some of the receptors sense this triangular feature, another square, another pyramid, and on and on and on, kind of geometrical analogies. So different receptors sense different feature of the molecules, and when the molecule that fits lock and key approach, it activates receptors. Receptor activate the cell, and the cell send the signal to the rest of the brain. And what's fascinating here that we have approximately 10 million different cells in our epithelium, but humans have approximately 350 different receptor types, which is sensitive to different features of the molecule. So rodents, let's say I'm working with mice, have 1,200 receptor types.
By the way, these receptor types, and comparing them to 3 types for vision, right? So this is so much more complex.
Exactly. Yeah. That's exactly my point. So basically we have 350 receptor types differently from vision, where we have only 3. And dogs has 900 receptor types. It's a humongous combinatorial capacity that allows us to smell basically any possible molecules. And from there, the receptor cells send their axons to the next part of the brain called olfactory bulb. There's some processing going on, and then sends to the brain. And what we're doing in the lab, we're trying to understand the logic, what the nose tells the brain, how the information is processed, analyzed, cleaned, denoised. So the system needs to solve multiple problems. You recognize coffee independently of its concentration. You can bring the coffee, you call it coffee, very close to your nose or far away, you still smell coffee. You recognize odors kind of at least in some range of concentration independently on the concentration. Then you can recognize the odor independently of background odor. So if you come into the coffee shop, you can smell the coffee, but you also can smell a croissant that is lying on nearby or on the oven. So your ability to recognize different objects in this olfactory scene is quite amazing, and it's probably simpler than in vision, when we recognize faces independently of the light, of the size, of the angle, in the presence of other objects. When we parse the scene on the objects, vision is much more computationally involved. And I'm not talking about currently color vision, I'm talking about general vision. And we know a lot about how this process, and computer scientists working on that. But overall, we have the same principle: some object invariance and some recognition in the presence of other objects, detectability, dynamical range, and the very basic principle like for any other sensory system. The main difficulty in our function, I believe, not on the processing that's happening after receptors on, but on understanding this odor field, because it's so rich that it's very hard to formalize. That's the main problem. But when the odor gets to the nose, actually the processing is, I would say, relatively simple, because in vision, when the photon hits the receptors, it takes 6 or 7 stations or synapses before it gets to the cortex. And it's processed, amplified, cleaned, filtered, threshold, you name it. In our function, it's only 2 synapses, 2 stages, and you're already in the cortex, and you already smell the coffee or smell the potato chip or whatever. Mm-hmm. So in some sense, neural processing is significantly simpler, but the field is much more complex.
So it's simpler in the sense that the pathways are shorter to the brain, but it's more complex in terms of the types of receptors that you're attuned to. Right. So this brings up another question, and that is that all animals seem to share a certain sort of genetic code when it comes to olfactory equipment. Is that right?
That's a fascinating question. So we have 350 odorant receptors. Mm-hmm. Mice have 1,200. Rat is a different species, but similar also to rodents, also have a similar number of receptors. So is our world similar to mouse world? We don't know. We don't know how similar or not, and can we share the same type? So if you do the genetic analysis and how similar our and rodent genes, we're kind of very much overlapping. Some genes are very special for rodents, but overall, kind of we distribute different number of the genes in the same genetic space. The problem is that we did a lot of genetic analysis, but we don't know how individual gene properties related to chemistry. And when I start saying, now we kind of with new data accumulation, new breakthroughs in the technology, we very close to accumulate enough data so we can start really building serious models and try to understand the differences between mice, human, and dogs' olfaction. By the way, the structure of human olfactory receptor had been reported a couple months ago in the Nature paper by one of my colleagues. It was a big deal.
Interesting. Awesome. Good stuff. So this actually also reminds me of the other question I'd raised earlier, which is, since you're talking about breakthroughs and new research, what have been the key points in the history of olfaction where we just learned something new and significant that took the field forward?
I think one of the main breakthrough happens in 1990 when there was discovery of olfactory receptor genes by Linda Buck and Richard Axel. That happens in New York, in Columbia. Mm-hmm. Richard they got the Nobel Prize 2004. That happens way before I started studying olfaction, but talking to the veterans in the field, when they read the paper of the discovery of the olfactory receptor, they said, well, that paper will get a Nobel Prize. Because it was absolutely obvious that will be complete, that will revolutionize the field. And since then, we know how many receptors we have. Since then, we have the tools to study this through genetics, and it completely changed the field. But from there, it was very slow progress, and the field was mostly occupied by people with genetic and molecular biology background. But the recent wave of researchers that coming into the field relatively in the last, let's say, 10 years was the computational people. And we start understanding the kind of how the information is processed, what's make the kind of how the nose and brain compute stuff, and kind of computational approaches to our function. It is a slow process. We don't have yet any big breakthroughs, but we having a build up of knowledge and ideas in that field.
Indeed. In fact, this is what sort of led me to your lab. So say a little bit more about this computational aspect. Where do you see the possibilities for synergy, between neuroscientists and data scientists, and where do you see the challenges?
There's multiple aspects here. So first of all, the effort by the laboratory in Google, where they screen basically a lot of odorants and try to build machine learning models to connect the chemical property of the molecules to your percept. And when I say percept, basically the subject were asked to quantify and explain how they feel. They give descriptors to the smell. It can be fruity, citrusy, or peanut buttery, or powdery. You can bring these descriptors and describe the smell. And if you analyze many odorants molecules and many with many descriptors, you can start building the models.
So when you say build the models, what you're talking about is going directly from molecular structure and the sort of physiochemical properties to a description in language, right? Exactly. That is that this structure means citrusy.
Exactly. And that basically try to solve the problem. If I give you the molecules, how does it smell?
Right.
We don't have a theory, but we have models about that. And that problem has been approached for, let's say, 15 years with different success, and with different models, different dimensionality reduction technique, different data sets, and people were trying to do it. But Google took it seriously and tried to crush it by the number of data. They have I don't remember, 10 to the 4, I don't remember the number of odorants that they analyzed, and they built this deep network that can predict the smell. They even spun out the company that will help perfumers to build their new perfume. And it's a very important endeavor. However, it does not teach us the underlying principles, because with it as if you have a table between wavelengths and the colors. I'm giving an example of the colors is much easier to, and you have this table of wavelengths and colors and all possible mixtures, but you don't know how receptors build up and the theory of three-color vision based on the property of the receptors and how they combined. We don't have this model yet. We have the big machine learning model that can predict it, but we don't understand the physics and we don't understand the logic of how to go from the chemistry to perception.
Right. Yeah, I thought that Google paper was fascinating, and they actually, the results were quite impressive in the sense that they said, okay, we can predict the odor of a certain kind of molecule. Where I was left wanting was, what are you going to do with this? Right? What's the use of this? And I can see some narrow uses, like perhaps creating a new perfume, although I can see that would also be complicated by the fact that odor doesn't have this nice additive property. But that notwithstanding, I can see that it could have some sort of focused kind of uses where a new molecule comes along, or you're maybe hypothesizing a molecule and what kind of smell it'll have, and you can do that, right? So I suppose you could do something like that, but I don't see it going much beyond that because you don't understand there's no real theory. It's an associative kind of a model.
We don't need the theory in order to make you buy the next detergent for your washing machine.
Indeed.
And that's actually a big driver.
Yeah.
When we think about perfumery, we think about perfume, some kind of fancy store. It's actually, perfumers are working on the factories trying to make your detergent smell nice, your soap smell pleasant. Mm-hmm. And a lot of chemical that we use in everyday life need to go through basic stuff. Actually, for chemists I talked to people working at Procter & Gamble, developing smell of detergent. It's a very difficult problem because you need to smell it in the store. Oh, that's okay. Then you need to smell it when you take it off the washing machine and it's still wet. And you need to smell it 5 days later when the smell almost gone, but the clothing still smelled like with a nice smell. And it's all chemistry and all perception and all testing and on. There's a lot of knowledge involved in designing such products, so it's a kind of very applied field. So I think that Google will find their niche, but I will let them do their job.
So where I was sort of moving towards was more in sort of the area of, let's say, health, right? Where, there was this article in the Times that described Siddhartha Mukherjee's cat, which was capable of, if it went and sat down next to a patient, it was the kiss of death, literally. It was able to smell cancer. I know you and I have talked about the fact that there was someone who actually learned how to recognize Alzheimer's, right? So it seems to me that smell is a highly, highly underutilized sense when it comes to things like medicine.
I 100% agree. It's completely uncharted territory. So basically, first of all, what you said is absolutely correct. And there's the other side. From one side, we want to predict from chemistry the percept. From another side, there's kind of what information we get and what information biology gets when it's smelling the different odors. And it was not just for pleasure only. No, it's not. Perfume was invented by humans, and it was something different. And I don't think that evolution of the system is due to perfumery. This is absolutely fascinating field of so-called volatile organic molecules that are surrounding us, and biology conquered this field. From the very first bacteria, when they navigate towards food, they find the gradient of the concentration of the food, the chemical senses. Bacteria has a sense of smell to find the food and kind of consume the food. To humans, along all the evolutionary tree, we have the sense of chemical sense. And this field of chemical molecules that are surrounded is, biology is using it, but we don't. As the quiet technological society, we completely cannot. We don't capture this field. We don't use it. But human body, for example, emit few thousand different volatile molecules. If I have a perfect microscope or telescope, whatever measuring device that I can measure this spectrum, I will be able to tell not only what did you eat today on breakfast and which type of beer you drank yesterday, but also the state of your liver and kidney and all other state, because everything affects your volatile metabolome. And biology, we know that because we can train animal to sense disease. We don't have sensors. We don't have really good devices to be able to do what biology can do. And that's actually absolutely fascinates me. And that's one of the big reasons why I wanted to study the sense of smell. It actually, at the beginning, it was more curiosity and interesting neural system to study and try to answer the previous question. But now I'm paying more and more attention because this is the gateway to the completely new informational field. Let me give a comparison. So it's like we now, at the level of discovery, the first application of radio wave. The first, like Marconi, who sent radio signal and measure radio signal from a far distance, and they conquer the radio frequency wave. He could not imagine how much more progress will be with this field from GPS, internet, Wi-Fi, you name it. I think if we conquer this field, we cannot predict even where that leads us. But this is very rich informational field, and we can measure not the health, the position of the source of, there's a lot of information that is not accessible to our devices. When dog walks into the room, it knows it can orient in the room based on the smell and can find, because it trained, it used the smell much more than us. It gets the signals we don't have. And for us, I think the big frontiers is definitely health. Can we diagnose diseases using the volatile molecules? And we need sensors, which we have very poor sensors so far. That's one of the reasons to study olfaction.
So what will this path look like to the electronic nose? And by path, I mean, in your experiments, you've demonstrated, and I'm sure others have as well, that you can train animals to recognize very complex smells. Yeah. And you can actually sort of feed them different concentrations and all of that stuff, and they seem to do a good job, right? That even when they sense it in a lower concentration, they're able to distinguish, between two different things. So what's the path to this electronic nose going to look like? What are the intermediate steps that we'll see before we get to the point where a computer can actually smell just like it can see or hear or read?
I don't know, honestly speaking, because over the many years, from the first chemical detectors, the progress in electronic nose was very, very slow. And none of the artificial sensors come very close to the biological noses. And the field progressing, we're developing better and better better materials, some organic semiconductors that are sensitive to molecules. There's a DNA, the nanotubes covered with DNA, you name it. Nanotechnology develops, and we're slowly but building up. But it's still much, much weaker and much less sensitive and much less versatile than biological nose. So what I believe is that we may conquer this world by learning from biology and by using the biology, by basically employing evolution, developed these receptors over millions of years. During millions of years, they developed these receptors, and maybe we can use these receptors, or maybe we can use the noses to sense it and kind of get the richness that that biological nose can measure. Actually, in my lab, I'm making a lot of effort in this direction, and we try to using the basic principles of biological information processing to understand and imitate and use it for chemical detection. One of the approaches that I've been developing in the lab is to read the information from the brain and decode the information about odors and use the whole nose as the chemical detector.
So let's walk through sort of a use case of this, right? So the equivalent would be that you have an animal, and let's say the animal looks cute and is acceptable to humans. You could literally take that into a hospital and have it smell patients. And it could have been trained to recognize certain kinds of diseases, right? So in the lacking an electronic nose, which would be sort of the end state, is that sort of what it would look like?
Two aspects here. You can train an animal to detect disease, and that's happening. Dogs have been trained to detect COVID. The giant African rats has been used in Africa to detect tuberculosis, and on and on and on and on. Mm-hmm. What actually I've been working and proposing it. Imagine if we can read the mind or the brain signal from, then you can skip the behavior. You don't need animal to perform some behavior, but you can read the signals from the brain and know what the receptors are sensitive. So ideally, we have, let me fantasize a little bit, some cyber animal with implanted electrodes that can communicate with us through, wireless system that you don't see anything, and you can read what the animal is thinking about, what the animal is sensing. And then you can actually detect way, way, way more molecules than trained dog can be trained for 1 or 2 molecules. But now you can actually having working mass spectrometer, and you can actually do instantaneous analysis. And it has tremendous applications if you think about it, from the security, health, agriculture, food quality, you name it. And it may substitute a lot of human work when humans are trained to detect, judge quality of the food, just a panel of humans, or quality of some deodorants, to security issues when you can screen the containers for drugs and narcotics or humans to health. And there's a lot of questions here, and I think that far in the future, and I don't know when we will be able to we imitate the human or the biological nose. We don't need to use the cyber animals, but cyber animals can fill the niche for now, and we can use the power of biological nose if we know how to do brain-machine interface to them.
Yeah, so how far can we get with animals? One of my previous guest was actually an animal activist, right? And we were talking about sort of the role of animals for advancing science and where do you draw the line. To me, this is like a fascinating area where you can actually, without harming animals, actually observe brain activity and try and understand olfaction. Where do we stand in this, in the larger scheme of things with respect to, using animals versus working towards sort of developing more cyber animals for olfaction?
I do believe that in a far future, we would not need animals to do this job. But meantime, you cannot compete with a trained dog. And the trained dog is very specialized animal, and a lot of effort has been dedicated to train dog to find, humans during earthquakes, or to find narcotics on the customer on the border, and on and on and on. this animal don't have fun life. This animal have really, serious training, and they serve us. And they serve, we use animal all the time for this. Now, doing cyber animal is probably the next step, but if we don't do it for fun or for purpose, and this purpose is to improve the human well-being and serve humans, I think it's a reasonable. It's a good reason. I would never. I take it very seriously.
And by cyber animals, you mean animals that have been equipped with?
Yes.
With electronics.
Yes, animal that equipped with some electronics.
Right.
Look, the experiments now going on. People are, we implant humans with some brain electrodes and help paraparamedics to move their arms and everything. There's research going on. It cannot be done without using animals. So we want to help humans. We have to use animals. We need to be super conscious about it, super careful. It's not an easy subject, but that's the problem. That's the problem that we need to solve. Now, if we minimize the pain and suffering of animals, but we'll be able to equip it with some external devices that allows us to communicate with the brain, it will open us a tremendous possibility that cannot be opened without that. And we'll fill the niche that we need to fill now, from detecting diseases, from preventing crimes, from deciphering this other space, which will serve humanity and help us to move forward. Ideally, maybe in 30, 50 years, we build electronic nose. I'll be super happy to replace it. But currently, I don't see how it can be done, because we have the need to measure this, but we don't have yet devices. And animals have this ability.
Great point. Where do you see breakthroughs occurring in the next 5 to 10 years?
First of all, I forgot who said that humans are very bad in predicting, especially future.
Sounds very familiar. Yeah. And I always tell people I hate to make predictions, but I have no qualms in asking other people to make them.
Also, when I grew up, nobody predicted internet. Everybody were predicting that we'll fly to the moon, but nobody were talking about internet. So I don't know. But seriously, I think we'll have some breakthrough in understanding the other space. And we will have a good understanding of the role of receptors and how the signals from individual receptors are combined to create the perceptor creating. I think in 10 years, we'll have much better understanding of fundamental function. This is from the scientific perspective. And I see the steady progress in the field, including the lab in the field that I'm now in and lab that I'm collaborating with. On the applied side, we'll have a progress in the detectors. We will be able, be it through animals, through use of some biological cells to detect some chemicals, or even with some slow progress in electronic detection. But I think we will start using the chemical detection in disease diagnostics.
What about mental health? Is that an area where this is maybe highly underutilized? Because I can't help but think that I don't remember where I read this now, but I remember seeing studies where people examined decision-making behavior under varying sort of environmental conditions, and one of them was light and smell, right? And they found that, I hope I'm not completely making all this up, but I'm quite sure I read they found that people's decisions tended to be harsher when things smelled bad. That is people's decisions tend to be softer and more generous when the environment around them was good, including the olfactory environment.
It's a controversial topic. It is a field of, psychology, which vaguely aware. So smell affect emotions, smell affect our decision making, smell affect our well-being. Many people study this. First of all, it's cool and interesting, but it's all on a descriptive level. But definitely some smell evokes some anxiety, some smell relax you. I don't know this, honestly speaking. This is definitely not my field, and there's a lot of popular kind of speculation about it. But when you smell perfume, you have some emotion about it. It does affect you. So it's real, but I don't know much what to comment about it.
No, I realize it's not my area of expertise either, but it's a fascinating area, and I do realize that this is very understudied and understood at the moment.
Absolutely, I talked to some perfumer who tried to convince me that smell help her to affect people and change their mind and change the decisions. I don't know.
Yep. Well, Dima, this has been absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much. I learned so much just by preparing for this conversation, and I continue to look forward to our collaboration and learning a lot more about olfaction.
Thank you very much, Vasant. It was my pleasure. I can talk. This is my favorite topic. I like it a lot. I do believe that we're in front of many, many interesting discoveries in the next, 10 years, but I don't know what they will be.
Fascinating, and look forward to working with you some more on this. It's a fascinating space. So thank you again.
Thank you very much. Thank you.